What's happening, everybody? Justin, Bridgewater's Finest on YouTube, Blockbuster_guy on Twitter. And here we are, Stanley Cup Playoffs 2017. We are ready to give out the hardest to win trophy in sports. After the greatest tournament in sports, it's the Stanley Cup Playoffs. The Stanley Cup will be awarded in just a few short weeks, and let's talk about these matchups, because there's some exciting stuff to talk about. And just right off the bat, before you even talk about any matchups, 5 Canadian teams. Look, there were no Canadian teams in the playoffs last year. To go from none to 5, that's fantastic. Not just that, but as I spoiled last night on Twitter, I think at least 1 Canadian team from the East and 1 Canadian team from the West is going to move on here to the second round. Look, if you followed the channel for years, you know exactly what this is. We're going to start in the Eastern Conference, and we're going to go through every single matchup. We're going to talk about home, away records, scoring, things like that, X factors, and we're going to figure out who's going to win these series. We're going to start in the East, then we're going to go to the West. It's going to be 2 videos, one for the East, one for the West. If you're a loyal SoundCloud listener, and you're like, I demand my podcast, don't worry. This is going to be in a podcast version on SoundCloud as well, and on iTunes, of course. As soon as you put it on SoundCloud, boom, it's on iTunes. That's going to be available for you. But YouTube is always where these predictions have been at. It's always where they're going to be at. Without further ado, let's do this. Eastern Conference, Round 1, 2017 Stanley Cup Playoffs predictions. Here we go. Let's kick things off in the Metropolitan bracket of the Eastern Conference first round matchups. That, of course, is a Met Division champion Washington Capitals taking on the number 2 wildcard team, the Toronto Maple Leafs. By the way, who said the Leafs were going to make it? This guy. Leafs made it. They, of course, now have the wonderful duty of having to play the Capitals. The Met 2 and Met 3 matchup sees Pittsburgh play host to Columbus. But let's start in Washington, Caps and Leafs. The Metropolitan Division champion, President's Trophy winning Washington Capitals, 55-27 straight up wins and losses on the season, scoring an average of 3.21 goals per game, which is one of the highest averages in the league, and only giving up 2.22. I believe Braden Holtby just won the Jennings Trophy, so that tells you all you need to know about how difficult a team this Washington team is to play against. 55-27, 3.21 goals per game, 2.22 goals against per game, taking on the wild card 2, the Toronto Maple Leafs, this young, hungry Toronto Maple Leafs team. 40-42 on the season, straight up wins and losses, 3.06 goals per game, 2.95 goals against. And by the way, when I say that, straight up wins and losses, a loss to me is a regulation loss, an overtime loss, a shootout loss. When you're in the playoffs, a loss is a loss. So that's the way we're going to treat these. It's not going to be this team was 55-14, 7-4. It's going to be this team was 55-27. That's what the team was in terms of games they won and games they lost. You don't get pity points in the playoffs. You win or you lose. Fair enough? Let's keep going. Season series here was 2-1 in favor of the Washington Capitals. Washington outscoring Toronto in those games 12-10. Nicholas Backstrom led the way in scoring for the Capitals. 23 goals with 63 helpers for 86 points. Backstrom was the number 4 scorer in hockey this season. Austin Matthews, the rookie, leading the way for the Toronto Maple Leafs. As far as I'm concerned, making a great case to be the next captain of that team. 40 goals in his rookie season, unheard of in the history of the Toronto Maple Leafs and virtually unheard of in terms of rookie scoring in general. To go with 29 assists for 69 points, nice. We'd be doing a disservice if we didn't talk about these series in terms of what's that? Situational gameplay. Absolutely. So we're going to look at how Washington did at home versus how Toronto did on the road, because those two teams are going to be playing each other. We're going to look at how Toronto did at home versus how Washington did on the road, because those two teams are going to be playing each other. And that's the way we're going to go for each of these series. Washington this season at home, 32-9 straight up wins and losses, the best home record of any playoff team in the first round this season. Toronto under 500 on the road, only 19-22. But it's also important to look at how have they done lately. It's not just a whole season picture, it's how they've done lately. So I thought I'd also look at the last 10 games within that same situation. Washington's last 10 home games, they're 7-3. They outscored opponents 21-15 in that 10-game span, not giving up many goals. Obviously, that's only a goal and a half allowed per game. Toronto, playing not too bad on the road lately, 6-4 in their last 10 road games, outscoring opponents 33-30. Toronto's road games get a little redonkulous. Let's flip the script there like we will in games 3 and 4. Let's put this series in Toronto. Toronto at home versus Washington on the road. Toronto 21-20 at home. You'd like a little bit of a better home record for a playoff team, but they got plenty of pity points in there that got them in. 21-20 straight up in Toronto. Washington 23-18 this season on the road. In the last 10 games, the records are even. Toronto at home and Washington on the road, they were both 6-4. Toronto outscoring opponents 28-26, Washington outscoring opponents just 34-33. Basically, what this is going to tell you is the games in Toronto are going to be a lot higher scoring than the games in Washington. Important to look at key injuries for both teams heading into this playoff series. And when I talk about key injuries, I'm not talking about a guy that was injured in November and the team didn't have him all season. I'm talking about recent, relevant injuries that may come into play in the series. On Washington's side, you're looking at John Carlson on the back end. He's nursing a lower body injury. You turn over to Toronto's side, and the two big injuries are obvious. Nikita Zaitsev on the back end, dealing with an upper body injury, and the big one, Freddie Anderson, nursing a head injury after being run over by Tom Sestito. And then everybody's favorite part, the X factors. Let's look at the biggest X factor that I think the Washington Capitals possess, which is that they have the biggest home ice advantage in round one. The best home record of any playoff team, taking on Toronto, who's tied for the third worst road record of any playoff qualifying team. That's their biggest X factor. Washington needs to hold serve at home. It shouldn't be difficult with as huge an advantage at home that Washington has. The X factor for the Leafs, and this one was fun because maybe it's a bit of a stretch, but I mean, look, let's talk, you and me. Nobody expects Toronto to win this series, right? Pretty well everybody is going with Washington. Spoilers, I'm going with Washington. But here's the thing about this Leafs team, and I'm going to quote one of the great geniuses that I've ever had the pleasure of experiencing in my lifetime. That genius is professional wrestling promoter Paul Heyman. Come on, you can see it right in my Twitter bio. I'm a wannabe Paul Heyman guy. The biggest X factor for the Toronto Maple Leafs is that they're too young to know any better. And what I mean by that is this, and I'm going to paraphrase a quote from the great Paul Heyman when I say this. Experience is the greatest inhibitor because you learn from experience what not to do. But it's the fearlessness to just go into something with reckless abandon that allows you to create something from nothing. But to me, that's a great strength. Because with that comes virtually no pressure. Look, this team is playing with house money. Fair enough to say that? This team is playing with virtually no expectations for this series. All the pressure and all the expectations are on Washington's side. There's none on Toronto's. And look, it's packed with rookies and second-year pros and incredibly talented players. These players, and I think Mike Babcock is smart enough to do this, these players need to just go out and play. That's what I would be saying to them in the room. Like, look, we're playing with house money. Nobody thought we were going to be here. Nobody at the beginning of the season expected that we were going to be here, but we're here. So we proved them wrong once already. Just go out there and just play hockey. You guys are ridiculously young, ridiculously talented. Look, you got a 40-goal scorer over here. You got a 30-goal scorer over here. Incredible chemistry in this room. You're all going to keep growing up together. This is an incredible experience. Just go out there and play hockey and have fun with it. Nobody expects you to do anything. So let's prove them wrong. Let's go out there and do something. If you start getting too deep in the X's and O's and the matchups, Washington is the dominant matchup. against Toronto in virtually every facet of the game, especially if Freddie Anderson doesn't play the first game or the first couple of games. If Curtis McElhinney's in there, there's probably virtually no chance that you're going to win unless you go in there and realize you have no pressure, you can relax, you can just play hockey. It's the guys on the other side that are gripping their sticks because everyone expects them to win, and that can be a great strength. As I spoiled for you a little bit earlier, though, I do expect the Washington Capitals to win this series. My official prediction for Leafs and Caps, I'm going to go Capitals in 5 games. I think Washington wins those first 2 games on home ice. Matter of fact, I think Washington goes up 3-0 in this series. But game 4 in Toronto, I expect the Leafs to win that game, get a little respectability, go out there and say, hey, we punched the President's Trophy winning team in the mouth at least once. Washington comes back to Washington for game 5. I just don't see any way that Toronto beats Washington in Washington. And if you can't do that, you're not going to win the series when you don't have home ice, certainly. But I think it's Caps in 5. They're not going to sweep Toronto. I really don't think. I'm going to give Toronto respectability from this Habs fan. I'm going to give Toronto the respectability to say, hey, you're going to get a game off these guys. But my official prediction is Washington in 5. And now to that Met 2 versus 3 matchup, Pittsburgh playing host to Columbus. Pittsburgh on the season, 50-32 straight up wins and losses, 3.43 goals scored per game, 2.85 goals allowed. Bit high for, a team with both Matt Murray and Marc-Andre Fleury, but in any case, 3.43 scored, 2.85 goals against. Columbus, 50-32 on the season as well. These two teams with identical win-loss records. 3.04 goals scored per game, 2.38 goals against. Season series between these two division rivals was tied at 2 games apiece. Columbus gets the edge in goal scoring in the series, 13-10. Top scorer for the Penguins, huge shock, Sidney Crosby, 44 goals, 45 assists for 89 points. Crosby was the number 2 scorer in hockey this season. Cam Atkinson leading the way for the Columbus Blue Jackets, 35 goals with 27 helpers for 62 points. But for a team that scores more than 3 goals per game, I think that speaks to the balanced scoring attack that Columbus has. This series is going to start in Pittsburgh, so let's look at Pittsburgh at home versus Columbus on the road. Pittsburgh at home this season, 31-10, second best home record of any playoff team this season. They were dynamite in Pittsburgh all season. Columbus 22-19 on the road, better than 500, which means they did their job. In the last 10 games, Pittsburgh at home 7-3. They've outscored opponents 36-28, 7 of those 10 wins. Columbus on the road under 500, not really getting it done lately. 4-6 on the road in their last 10 games, being outscored 24-27. Put the series back in Columbus, the Blue Jackets 28-13 on home ice this season. That's a pretty good record. Pittsburgh under 500 on the road as well, 19-22. Not great. For a team that only lost 32 games on the season, 22 of them came on the road. And in the last 10 games, those records have mostly held true. Columbus in their last 10 home games, 7-3, an equal mark to Pittsburgh, outscoring teams 28-18. Pittsburgh away from home, their last 10 road games, an even 5-5, 27-26, the scoring in those games in favor of Pittsburgh. Key injuries that could come into play this series, of course, the major injury for Pittsburgh, Chris Letang. He's out for the rest of the season with, I believe, a sprained neck. I know it's a neck injury. Evgeny Malkin also nursing a shoulder injury. We're pretty sure he's going to be able to go for game 1, but the shoulder is something to watch out for. On Columbus's side, their great young defenseman, Zach Werenski, also nursing a shoulder injury, could come into play in the series. Biggest X factor here that I see for the Pittsburgh Penguins, the goaltending is a must-win for Pittsburgh in this series. Matt Murray, 100% must outplay Sergei Bobrovsky for Pittsburgh to win this series. This series is a lot closer than some people might think it is. This division, the Met division is just a murderer's row. Like, the Met division is just incredible. It's a much closer series than some people are looking at it as. The goaltending is a must-win. Matt Murray cannot be outplayed by Sergei Bobrovsky. If Matt Murray is outplayed by Sergei Bobrovsky, Pittsburgh cannot be afraid to go back to Marc-Andre Fleury. I know you don't want to shake this young goaltender, but you've still got an opportunity here. This is Pittsburgh's window. This is still this team's prime to win championships. If your young guy falters, you cannot be afraid. This is why you kept Marc-Andre Fleury. You cannot be afraid to go back to Marc-Andre Fleury if Murray falters. You can't be afraid to do that. He's on your roster for a reason. He's done it before at the international level, at the NHL level. He can do it. So the Penguins cannot be afraid to go back to him if Murray falters. Biggest X factor I see here for the Blue Jackets, I think for the first thing, they need to ride that balanced scoring attack. Again, for a team that scores 3.04 goals per game and their leading scorer only has 62 points, it's a balanced attack there for Columbus. They need to ride that. They need to be able to ride 4 lines deep to beat a team like Pittsburgh, because it's exactly what they're going to get on the other end. Another big thing here, I think Columbus needs to figure out a way to steal a road game early in this series. Like if Columbus can go into Pittsburgh and win one of those first 2 games, that will be so huge because it puts all the pressure on Pittsburgh. And to really see if this team has the mettle to win a back-to-back championship, you got to pressure them early. That's a huge, huge X factor for Columbus in this series, is to attempt to get one of those early road wins, really put all the pressure back on Pittsburgh. See what the Penguins have this year. In a matchup of 2 road teams that were either not very good in the regular season or not playing the greatest lately, you got to defer to a home team series. That's what I'm going to do here. So I like the Penguins. My official prediction for Pittsburgh versus Columbus is the Pittsburgh Penguins to win the series in 7 games, and I think it's a home team series. Pittsburgh wins 1 and 2, Columbus wins 3 and 4. Pittsburgh wins 5 back in Pittsburgh. Columbus wins 6 back in Columbus. Comes back to Pittsburgh. Game 7. Matt Murray shines, and the Penguins win the series. So there we go. That sets up a second round matchup of Washington versus Pittsburgh. The matchup we still all want to see. That's the way I think the Mets going to go. Let's head to the Atlantic now, of course, the division that is near and dear to my heart, and let's talk about this. The Atlantic Division champion, my Montreal Canadiens, they're going to be taking on the Wild Card 1 team, a team they are very familiar with in the playoffs, have a little bit of bad blood with, the New York Rangers. Montreal 47 and 35 on the season, 2.76 goals scored per game, 2.44 goals allowed per game, taking on the New York Rangers. 48 and 34 on the season, so 1 game better. 3.12 goals scored per game, 2.68 goals allowed. And remember, of course, the Rangers missed Henrik Lundqvist for a big chunk of the season. Season series between these 2 teams was dominated by my Montreal Canadiens. They won all 3 matchups against the Rangers this year, outscoring them 11-7. Max Pacioretty leading the way in scoring for Montreal, 35 goals, 32 helpers, for 67 points. Matt Zuccarello leading the way for the Rangers, just 15 goals and 44 assists, 59 points as the leading scorer on the team. Same deal with Columbus. It speaks to a very balanced scoring attack for the New York Rangers. Montreal at home versus the Rangers on the road. Montreal at home 24 and 17 this season. Rangers 27 and 14 on the road. The Rangers were an incredible road team for the majority of this season. Take a look at the last 10 games. Montreal 6 and 4 on home ice, outscoring opponents 26-20. The Rangers kind of stumbling here at the end of the season, only 4 and 6 on the road, with even scoring in those games, 28-28. At home this season, the Rangers just 21 and 20, certainly nothing to write home about. At home, Montreal on the road, 23 and 18, definitely getting the job done on the season on the road. You take a look at the last 10, the Rangers had really bad stretch here at the end of the season in their home games. Just 2 and 8 in their last 10 home games to close the season, being outscored in those games 23-32. Montreal, however, really caught fire on the road, which could be This could spell big trouble here for the Rangers. Montreal 8-2, so the inverse of that in their last 10 road games, outscoring opponents 27-20. Rangers playing basically injury-free right now. The only key injury, the one worth watching in this series, is Shea Weber for Montreal, who's been nursing a lower body injury for a while. That's something to watch out for. Biggest X factors here from Montreal in this series, I think there's two of them. Number one, they have to win the goaltending battle. These are two teams that are built very similarly, and they're both built on goaltending out. So Montreal needs to win the goaltending matchup here. Pretty easy to say that they could do that with Carey Price, but that is Henrik Lundqvist on the other side, and Lundqvist ain't no bitch. So Carey Price has to outplay Henrik Lundqvist in this series. But it's not just that. The other thing Montreal needs to do, that I believe they need to do to win this series, is the secondary scoring, the depth, has to play better than the Rangers' depth. I'm talking about guys like Paul Byron, Arturi Lehtinen, Philip Deneau. These players need to outscore the Rangers' depth players in order for Montreal to comfortably win this series. If they don't do that, it can't just be about Pacioretty and Radulov and Galchenyuk. It can't just be about the high-end players. It's those depth players, the guys behind them in terms of who you would expect to score. Those are the players that really need to come alive for Montreal to win this series. One of the biggest X factors here that I see for the Rangers, I have to question their endurance, because I have to ask if this Rangers team is out of gas. Again, they really stumbled down the stretch. They're just 8-11 since the end of February. So that's all their games in March and the couple of games they had at the beginning of April. They're only 8-11. That does not read as a playoff team to me. So I have to ask whether or not the Rangers simply don't have the endurance for this time of year. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out once the series starts. I talked again about the Rangers scoring balance, and that is very true. The Rangers ice 9 players who score at least 1 goal or more in any given 7-game span throughout the regular season. They may need 9 different scorers to score in this series to pull off the upset here and to beat Montreal. They've got the scoring depth to do that. Those guys need to show up. But come on, let's be honest here. You weren't really expecting me to bet against my own team, were you? It doesn't just come down to being a homer. It comes down to how the teams are playing lately. I think this is Montreal's time. And look, as a Montreal fan, I haven't really commented much on the Shea Weber for PK Subban trade. Only a little bit on Twitter when it happened. I was really not happy with it when it first happened. Now, having seen the product on the ice, I'm feeling a little bit better about it. But that trade boils down to this. The only reason you trade PK Subban for Shea Weber is that you think Shea Weber gives you the best chance to win now. Montreal realizes they've got a very short window here with the best goaltender in the world under contract. It's 2 years. It's this year and it's next year. So the only reason that you make that trade is that you think Shea Weber gives you the best chance to win a cup now versus, getting the rest of the career of PK Subban. And that shows you just how desperate this Montreal franchise is to bring the cup not only back to Canada, but back to Montreal and prove that, we are the top franchise in hockey. That's the only reason that you make a trade like this, is because you think Weber gives you the best chance to win now. So I got to put my trust in Marc Bergevin. I got to put my trust in the Montreal Canadiens. I believe the Montreal Canadiens, and this is my official prediction, will beat the New York Rangers, and I think they'll beat them in 6 games. I think these two teams split the first 4 games. New York takes home ice advantage away from Montreal in Game 2. Montreal takes that away from the Rangers in Game 4. So this is a 2-2 series heading back to Montreal for Game 5. I think Montreal wins that game, and then it goes to Game 6 in New York. I think Montreal pulls off the victory in New York in Game 6, wins the series, goes on to the second round. And the final Eastern Conference matchup to talk about before we move over to the West is that Atlantic 2 versus 3 matchup, Ottawa taking on Boston. Ottawa 44-38 on the season, 2.59 goals scored per game, 2.61 goals allowed per game. And what that means is that they allowed more goals than they scored. The Bruins, an identical 44-38 on the season, 2.85 goals scored, 2.59 goals against. Season series here was dominated by the Ottawa Senators. They won all 4 games between these two teams, outscoring Boston in those games 11-6. Top scorer for Boston, Brad Marchand. What a season. 39 goals, 46 helpers, 85 points. He was the number 6 scorer in the NHL this season. Erik Karlsson, of course, leading the way for the Senators. 17 goals, 54 helpers for 71 points. Let's take a look at these games in Ottawa. Ottawa at home versus Boston on the road. Two teams were very similar. Ottawa 22-19 at home this season. Would have expected or hoped for maybe a little bit better at home, but they got plenty of points in there. 22-19 at home. Boston 21-20 on the road. So these two teams very close. And in terms of how they're playing lately, the records are identical. Both Ottawa and Boston are 6-4 in their last 10 games. Ottawa at home, Boston on the road. Ottawa has outscored opponents at home 22-17 in that span. Boston has outscored opponents on the road 37-32. Boston's road games get a little crazy. Let's flip the script now. Let's put the series in Boston. Boston at home versus Ottawa on the road. Boston 23-18 in Boston this season. Ottawa on the road 22-19. They did their job. 500 on the road. In the last 10 games, Boston also 6-4 at home, outscoring opponents 30-18. They really clamp down defensively when they're playing at home. Ottawa on the road, not so much in the last 10 games, only 3-7 in that span, being outscored by their opponents 21-31. Couple of key injuries on the defensive side of the puck to worry about in this series, one for each team, and they're pretty high-profile defensemen. Starts right at the top there, Ottawa with Erik Karlsson nursing a foot injury. We'll have to see if that comes into play in this series. On Boston's side, exact same injury. Torrey Krug on Boston's defensive core, also nursing a foot injury. Biggest X factor that I see here for the Senators, the defensive core has to step up and play their best hockey of the season in front of Craig Anderson. It cannot just be Erik Karlsson. If it's just Erik Karlsson, Ottawa's going to lose this series. Ottawa's got talented defensemen. They need to step up, play their best team defensive hockey of the season for Ottawa to pull off this win. Biggest X factor here for Boston, I think, is going to be psychological. Boston needs to take the regular season and just push it away. It has to be meaningless to them now, and sometimes that's a bigger psychological hurdle to get over than it might seem. The regular season has to be meaningless to the Bruins here. They lost all 4 games in Ottawa. If that was a playoff series, they would have been swept. But they need to put that behind them. It's a whole new series. Everybody is 0-0. Boston needs to treat it that way. The Bruins also need to win out at home. They need to hold serve at home here. Ottawa is beatable in Ottawa. Boston cannot lose a game in Boston. If they do, I don't see that they have a path to win this series. I said Ottawa is beatable in Ottawa. I believe that, and I believe the Boston Bruins are going to win this series. My official prediction has the Boston Bruins defeating the Ottawa Senators in 6 games. I like Boston to come out game 1 of this series and punch Ottawa in the mouth. Boston wins game 1. Ottawa brings it back, wins game 2. They go to Boston. Boston wins 3 and 4. That's how I think it's going to go. Come back to Ottawa for game 5. Ottawa's going to win that game. Go back to Boston for game 6. Boston's going to hold serve in the TD Garden. Boston wins the series, knocks out Ottawa for a second round date with the Montreal Canadiens. Who doesn't want to see Montreal and Boston renew their friendly acquaintance in the second round of these playoffs? I think everybody does. So let's see it. I like Montreal to beat the Rangers, and I like Boston to upset, quote unquote. I guess it's an upset technically. I like Boston to beat Ottawa. There we go, folks. There's the Eastern Conference done for you. We'll go over the predictions here one more time. Met number 1 versus the wild card number 2. Washington playing host to Toronto. I like the Capitals to win that series in 5 games. I like Toronto to only win game 4 on home ice in that series. Met 2 versus Met 3, Pittsburgh playing host to Columbus. I like the Penguins to pull it out there with their experience and with their top-end talent, but it's going to be a 7-game series, and the home team is going to win every game, Pittsburgh in 7. Montreal and the Rangers move into the Atlantic Division now. Atlantic number 1 versus the number 1 wildcard team. I like Montreal to win that series in 6 games. It's 2-2 after 4. Montreal wins 5, and Montreal wins 6 on the road in New York. Montreal wins that series in 6. And in the Atlantic 2 versus 3 matchup, Ottawa playing host to Boston. I like the underdog Bruins to beat Ottawa in that series in 6 games. Boston wins game 1 in Ottawa. Home teams hold serve. Boston wins in game 6 at home to win that series. So in the second round, I like Washington, Pittsburgh, and I like Montreal, Boston. Now, let's get on to the Western Conference. For the YouTube audience, this is where this video is going to end, and then we're going to pick up the Western Conference as we go. For the podcast listeners, here we go with the West. For the benefit of the YouTube audience, I'll do my closing. That's it for me. Justin, Bridgewater's Finest on YouTube, Blockbuster_guy on Twitter. Come back in the next video where we're going to talk about the Western Conference. Here we go.